Today we begin a sermon series about Simon Peter. He was an ordinary fisherman who was a follower of Jesus. He was faithful yet flawed. Peter was the first to profess Jesus as the Son of God, and yet later he denied even knowing him. Peter went on to give his life for the sake of God's call in his own life. And in this series, we're taking an in-depth dive into the story, the faith, and the character of Simon Peter. This series and the sermon today are based on the book and sermon series by Adam Hamilton, preached some time ago at Church of the Resurrection. And as we begin our series on Simon Peter, I want to remind you that this character he's kind of a big deal in the Gospels. Of course, we know that the Gospels tell the stories of Jesus, who is the central character. But if you look for other leading characters, Simon is one of them. He's one of the most prominent in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these four Gospels that tell the stories of Jesus. You remember that Jesus has 12 apostles or disciples that he invited to follow him during his time on earth and learn what life is like as a part of God's kingdom. And of these 12, Peter is mentioned over 200 times in these four books. And the other 11 receive mention less than 50 times. Even John, who was known as the beloved disciple, perhaps was the author of the fourth gospel, is mentioned just 18 times. And what's great about reading the stories of Simon Peter is that we find someone who gets it wrong a lot. He is an imperfect follower of Jesus. He's trying to follow Jesus, but he blows it. He's confused, he argues with Jesus. And then on the night before, when Jesus is arrested, Simon Peter denies knowing Jesus at all. And it could be that Simon wanted us to see his life in that way. You see, the Gospels weren't written down until after Simon's death. He was a great leader in the early church, and we probably have these stories in the four Gospels because he himself would have told them over and over again as he was sharing the stories of Jesus. He wasn't afraid to be embarrassed about his failures as a disciple. In fact, I believe that he may have known that hearing about his flawed and faithful life would help other people. I think that maybe he knew that it would help us to know that you can be a disciple and sometimes you're going to mess it up. He's teaching us something about being a follower of Jesus by his example. When we consider Peter, I think we're supposed to see ourselves in this story. I can learn from Peter about my own life as a follower of Jesus who's trying to be faithful and still makes mistakes. So let's take a closer look at Simon's story. Simon, you remember, grew up in the town of Bethsaida, which is on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. The name Bethsaida means house of fishers, and so it was a place where fishermen lived. It was a fishing village. In ancient times, it was on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and yet today the waterline has shifted and it's a few miles away from the coast. Simon was born, of course, not Simon Peter. Peter was a nickname that he'd receive later from Jesus. He was born Simon. He had a brother named Andrew, and his father's name was Jonah, and they fished for a living. Simon probably learned to fish from his dad. And when he grows up, his father passes along the fishing business to Simon and Andrew. They own their boat. They have a couple of guys who work for them. They're professional fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. Simon marries a girl from Capernaum, which is about 4 miles to the west, just on the other side of the Jordan River. And Simon moves his business, moves his home from Bethsaida to Capernaum, probably because of the tax benefits. We know that taxes on the west side of the Jordan River were cheaper for fishers than they were on the east side of the Jordan. So Simon lives in his house there in Capernaum with his brother, Andrew, and his mother-in-law and his wife. Now, there's a few things that we can say about Simon that may not immediately come to us from the text. But it's likely that Simon loved the water. He's grown up around it. He's grown up in it. This is how he makes his living. And I wonder how many of you spent some time at a lake this summer, or maybe by the water. Maybe Lake Sherwood or Lake Shawnee, or further off in Table Rock Lake. Maybe you went to Branson. I love spending time by the water. One of my favorite places to run here in Topeka is on the trail around Lake Shawnee. And I don't know about you, but being close to the water sometimes somehow seems to let me breathe a little easier, to take deeper breaths physically and emotionally and spiritually. And I like to think that Simon has this kind of relationship with the water. I imagine that he loved being at the lake. We also know that Simon had a boat. And if you live at the lake, you probably want to have a boat. And I don't know how many of you have boats, but I've heard if you have a boat, sometimes you think, well, I just maybe want a little bigger boat than the one that I have. Well, we know that Simon's boat was about 27 feet long. Well, how do we know that? Well, during a drought in 1986, an amateur archaeologist discovered an ancient fishing boat on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel. We have a picture of it here. Maybe you've seen this boat. It's known as the boat of the Sea of Galilee, or the Jesus boat, some would call it. Scientists dated this boat to the 1st century A.D. The remains are 27 feet long, they're 7.5 feet wide, and a bit less of 4.5 feet high of what remains here of this boat. It's in a museum now today. It's a structure built around it to protect it. And of course, this is probably not Simon's boat, and it's likely that Jesus never rode in this boat, but we know that this was a boat from that time. And so Simon probably spent time at the lake and used a boat maybe just like this to earn a living. It would have had a mast and sails there in the middle. Of course, he earned his living catching fish. He would use this in his job. And you remember that in the 1st century, the standard staple food of the Roman Empire was fish. Most people couldn't afford beef. Lamb was too expensive, but they could afford fish. And if you were wealthy, maybe you could have fresh fish, and so you might have it grilled. And if you weren't, most people couldn't afford fresh fish, and so they had it dried or salted or pickled. Now, none of those really sound very good to me, but it was the standard food of the day. Simon fished in a boat like this by casting nets out into the water. Of course, he had to catch many fish at once, more than you could catch just on a single hook and line. And he was on the water catching fish at night. It was a technique to help them draw in more fish. Simon would throw the nets out into the water and haul them in again over and over again, night after night. So I want you to imagine for a little bit, what is life like for Peter? Imagine this person, Simon. And you can close your eyes if you want. Just imagine looking at Simon's hands. What do his hands look like? Are they manicured? Are they well clipped, well kept? Does he use lotion that morning? Probably not. They're probably rough with calluses. His fingernails probably torn. You know, he's a guy who works with his hands. This is Simon. Then you can open your eyes if you want, and I want you to imagine, well, how did you think he speaks? What kind of language does he use? He doesn't go to church very much. He's a non-religious person. His speech is maybe a little salty. Does he always tell cute jokes, knock-knock jokes? Or maybe does he have some stories that he shares that aren't ones you might share in polite company? And so when he gets off work, what do you think Simon does with his buddies? Where does he go? What does he drink? Dr. Pepper, lemonade? We know, of course, they didn't have Dr. Pepper then, but they had beer, and I'm guessing that he went out with his friends and had a few beers when he was done with work. And you're starting to get a picture of who Simon is. And this is the man on whom we want to focus our attention. He works hard at night. His hands are calloused. He probably lives a rough life. It's certainly very simple. So let's take a closer look at the scripture passage for us today. Simon, Andrew, James, and John are done fishing for the day. They have been fishing all night, and they are on the shore washing their nets. They're taking out the plants and debris that they would have dragged up, and on this night, they had no luck. They'd caught no fish. And you had to clean your nets, or else they would rot. And you use your nets to make a living, so you've got to do this every day. You've got to take care of them, and they're just a little bit discouraged. They've been working all night long, haven't caught anything. And I wonder, have you ever been fishing and not caught anything? I don't know about you, but for some, I've heard it can be a pretty common thing. Well, maybe it's not common. It's common for me. I'll say that. When I go fishing, I usually don't catch anything. It can be a little bit discouraging, except, well, I'm kind of used to not catching anything, so I'm not as discouraged. But it's a different story for these guys. They are professionals. This is how they make their living, and they haven't caught anything. And they've fished all night long. They're cleaning their nets, getting ready to go home to sleep. And then Jesus comes along. And he is teaching a massive crowd of people. And then we read in Luke 5, verse 3, Jesus boarded one of the boats, the one that belonged to Simon, then asked him to row out a little distance from the shore. Jesus sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. Jesus got on Simon's boat kind of without asking. He just steps on and then asked Peter to row him out a little bit from the shore on the water. And you know how this works. If you're out on the water, those that are on shore can hear you. The water acts as a bit of a sounding board. And so he was out on the water to be able to speak to this crowd and not get pressed and pushed by them into the lake. And can you imagine how Simon felt at this moment? Jesus, are you serious? I've been on the water all night long. I've been doing this all night, and you want me to push you out, and you want me to just sit there while you're preaching? Jesus, I'm tired. We're cleaning our nets. I'm about to go home. But he doesn't say that. Simon gets in the boat, and he takes Jesus out a little way. And I just imagine Jesus preaching to the crowd, and the boat's not very big, so Simon is seating right behind him. And maybe he's got his oar stuck in the mud a little bit and so that it doesn't float off into the lake. And he's stuck listening to Jesus. He can't even fall asleep because everyone is there watching him. Can you see what Jesus is doing here? Jesus is borrowing Peter's stuff. Jesus is using his boat to help deliver his message to the world. You see, Jesus likes to borrow our stuff to accomplish what God has in mind for the world. Jesus will use what we have, our skills, our abilities, whatever it is that we have. Jesus looks at our lives, yours and mine, and says, I can use you if you let me. He didn't ask Simon Peter to build him a platform for the crowd. Simon wasn't a carpenter. He's not going to ask him that. He was a fisherman. He has a boat, and so he asked to use his boat. Can I borrow your boat? Could you take me offshore just a little bit? He knows Simon, and he knows what he has to offer, and he asks to use it. You see, Jesus asks the same thing of us. Jesus knows you and knows what you have to offer and asks, can I use you to be about my work? Jesus asks us to help. Now, what does that look like exactly? Well, you might hear Jesus asking you to help on Sunday morning when you hear some announcements, or maybe when you take a look in the bulletin and you see some opportunity available. And sometimes you may listen to Jesus speaking through someone else and saying, listen up, I need you here. You might hear Jesus asking you to help through the offering invitation. When you give financially to support God's work through this church, you help make amazing things happen. God is at work in and through this congregation, and your financial support is a response to Jesus' invitation to use some of what we have to be about God's work. We offer a portion back to God in gratitude and to be a part of God's mission in Topeka and Shawnee County. Maybe you hear Jesus asking you to help through our talent auction. It's coming up here in a few weeks. What abilities or skills do you have? Do you know how to bake? Can you make things with your hands? Do you have extra tickets to a game? Can you paint or do yard work? You have the chance to offer those, that someone might be able to use them, and together we might be about God's work right here in Shawnee County. So let me ask you a question. What is your boat that Jesus can use? What resources do you have that might be a part of God's work in our world? Are you letting Jesus use them? So what happens next in verse 4? We see, he says this, when he finished speaking to the crowds, he said to Simon, row out farther into the deep water and drop your nets for a catch. Jesus stops preaching and asks Simon to row out farther and drop the nets. Now, did you notice here in this story, we have no idea what Jesus is saying to the crowd. Luke doesn't even bother to write it down. Now, it's not like the author didn't think that Jesus' words are essential. Luke shares many things that Jesus says and shares and teaches and preaches to crowds of people, but not here, not in this story. And it could be because, in this case, what Jesus was saying to the crowd wasn't the most important thing. The message is in Peter's response to Jesus' invitation to row out farther and to drop the nets for a catch. You remember, the nets are clean, or almost clean. He's done for the day. Cleaning them took some time. They were dry and they were done fishing for the night. Jesus is a carpenter. Simon is a professional fisherman. He just got done for the day with no luck, and this carpenter is going to tell him how to fish? Jesus wants him to go out and do it again, get his nets dirty again? Really? Now Simon doesn't protest like this. At least it's not recorded that he protests like this. We see in verse 5 that Simon replied, "Master, we've worked hard all night and caught nothing. But because you say so, I'll drop the nets." And this is the most critical line. Because you say so. Because you say so, Jesus, I'll drop the nets. They go out and fill the nets with fish so full that they almost break. The ships almost sink. Because you say so, Jesus. Simon doesn't want to know what's going to happen when he lets his nets down into the water. I imagine he had a dozen good reasons why he didn't want to do what Jesus was asking him to do. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that this happens in my own life. There are times when I feel like Jesus is asking me to do something, or to speak to someone, or to say something, and I come up with an excuse. Oh, I don't have time. I don't think it's going to make any difference. I have a dozen other things I could be doing right now. But because you say so, I'll do it. Jesus, because you say so. Now, I don't always do this. I confess that there are times when I don't respond to some nudge or urge to do something or say something that just very well may be an invitation from Jesus. There are times when Jesus wants to use my stuff to be about God's work, and I don't always say yes. And I want to say yes every time. It's one of the ways that I'm growing in my faith. And the good news is that God gives us the strength to say yes. The Holy Spirit enables us to be a part of God's work. When Jesus asks us to use our stuff to be about God's work, we can say yes. And even if we don't say yes every time, we can say yes more and more often. Jesus invites Simon to be a part of the work of fishing for people. Simon says, "Because you say so, Lord," when he's casting out the nets, and then he gives him the next task, the next opportunity, and says, "Don't worry, Simon, you will be fishing for people." Jesus asks him to follow him, and he leaves everything. Jesus asks Simon to fish for people, and he does. Jesus is inviting us, you and me, to be a part of this movement for God's kingdom. You see, Jesus was fishing for people that morning. He invited Simon and Andrew, James and John to join him. And they're going to love God with all their heart and love their neighbors as they love themselves. But they're not going to do that every time. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to mess up. They're going to love themselves, and they're going to love their enemy even when it's difficult. They're going to be a part of God's transformation of the world with the good news of God's kingdom. They're going to invite people to be a part of this movement that will heal a broken and messed up world. Jesus says, go on, fish for people. He helps them know who they are and who God is. And this very same invitation is for us. Jesus asks, can I use you? Can I use your stuff to be a part of my work? And then invites us to go fish for people. Will you pray with me? And it's just a simple prayer today. If you feel like praying it, Jesus says, come and follow me. And you can offer a one-word prayer. It's really simple. Just say yes. And you can whisper it to Jesus. Yes, I will follow you. Yes, I want to be your disciple. Yes, you can use my boat. Yes, I want to fish for people. Oh God, use us as a congregation. Help us to be fishers of people. Help us to faithfully follow you even when we don't feel like it. We offer our lives to you. In your holy name, amen.